Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 1 discussion. Grinding Gear Games yesterday put out a whole bunch of information about the Legacy of Phrecia event. There have been two little changes since that came out. I wanted to quickly go through those. Those have both been announcements they've made over on the Path of Exile 1 subreddit. On top of that, while I did a live stream discussion going through all of the details of this post, what I wanted to do is just summarize some of the most frequently asked questions and my responses to them. So this is going to be the summary. If you're interested, the massive live stream I did yesterday discussing through this as it came out, that is something that's still up on YouTube, but it's about 3 hours long. Make up your own mind whether you're up for looking at it. So this post contains all of the changes that are being made to all of the classes, all of the Phrecia ascendancies. Some of them are big, some of them are small. Also, in the area modifiers section, they list all of the modifiers that can apply to areas. Basically, think of this as like a cartography scarab of risk applying to every zone that you walk into, except a number of modifiers that can be particularly obnoxious are not going to show up. So, both reflect mods, physical reflect and elemental reflect, are not available here. Ground effect modifiers, so shocked or burning ground, and also twinned bosses, these are not going to be things that can come up. The reason that they've gone with twinned here is that there's a small number of bosses that don't really have any support for that. On top of that, a number of build blocking things, but we discussed all that in the live stream. What's new is monsters steal power, frenzy, and endurance charges on hit. This is something that is build bricking for a small number of builds. Most of the time, this is free quantity, free rarity, or maybe not quite free quantity and rarity, but pretty close to it. It's one of the lower impact map mods. But there are a number of builds that will find that this mod is particularly toxic, and as a result, it is one that's not going to apply here. So the pool of mods that are going to come up randomly is going to be fairly small, and that means that the nastier ones, such as just unconditional increased monster damage, and also probably nastiest of all is player maximum resistances are nerfed, these modifiers are going to be more common as a result of these particularly odious ones being excluded. So that's the first piece of new news. The second piece of new news relates to the Harbinger ascendancy. The Harbinger ascendancy had some information that was on the Path of Exile 1 wiki that was actually incorrect. The Path of Exile 1 wiki stated that you could only have one of the Harbinger minions active at any given time. The correct information, which has been confirmed by Grinding Gear Games, is that both in the past and now, you can have one of each type of Harbinger minion. So you can have one Greater Harbinger of Time that comes from the ascendancy, or you can have one that comes from the item that grants Greater Harbinger of Time, but you can't have two of the same one from your ascendancy and one from a unique item. So that is a clarification associated with the Harbinger ascendancy. That means the Harbinger ascendancy is a lot less bad than I thought it was yesterday, because I took at face value that the wiki was correct. The wiki usually is correct, but there are just some things you can't test at the moment, and particularly with Phrecia ascendancies, other sorts of temporary game content, there's going to be mistakes on it because it's not something that's organized by Grinding Gear Games, it's organized by ordinary players instead. So going through the various ascendancies, just going through what I think are the highest impact changes. Firstly, for the Ranger, Whisperer, not really getting nerfed at all. This was crazy good in the past. It's still going to be crazy good. It's slightly different to what it was, but it's not really any worse. This is going to be a really strong ascendancy setup. It can be used in conjunction with Mana Forged Arrows, and it can be used in conjunction with a few other things as well. Basically, if you want to stack mana, you're going to be playing Whisperer. You're going to be stronger than anything you can do in the base game that is involving stacking mana in most cases, except for certain things related to spells. For the Marauder, the most frequently asked question is, what's up with Ancestral Commander? So, one of the important things is that the nodes that everyone took that were just raw defensive power, they're being nerfed. 3 endurance charges down to 2, that's still fine. That is still good enough to be worth an ascendancy notable. And Ancestral Defiance is also getting a third of its power taken off. This is still fine. This is still going to be your automatic points 1 and 2 on a lot of Ancestral Commander builds. However, the thing that is really transformative here is Call of the Ancestors. Call of the Ancestors was something that made slam builds better, but that was also really bad on a bunch of other setups. So what's happening here? Warcry speed is getting faster. So essentially, what they're trying to do here is promote a style of play where you are manually warcrying. If you're willing to do that, then there's definitely a payoff for it in Call of the Ancestors. 200% increased warcry speed is a lot. That was previously 30% reduced Warcry speed. So you're going from 70% base to 300% base. That's a massive buff. However, 30% reduced Warcry cooldown recovery rate, whereas it used to be 120% increased Warcry cooldown recovery rate. What this means is that this is one of those stats that is important to get if you're automating your Warcries. The more of this stat that you can get, sure, you're going to end up draining more mana from yourself, but the payoff is definitely worth it. This means that Ancestral Commander slams is going to be a lot harder to get online than it used to be. It's still very viable, but it's a later game build than it was before. And as a result, I think if you're wanting to play Ancestral Commander, you probably want to experiment with something else. Otherwise, there's a number of changes to some of the tattoo effects that used to exist during Trials of the Ancestors League. So during Trials of the Ancestors, there are a couple of effects that were only available on tattoos that went Legacy. So these tattoos, they still exist in Standard, but you can't get them anymore. And these would cause various effects, like a Spirit of Counter to be summoned that causes 15% previously, now 25% of damage that you take from hits to be taken from your next tattoo's life before you. And Utula's Leadership. Utula's Leadership has been unconditionally buffed, and unconditionally buffed by a lot. Kaum's Leadership has been buffed for almost every situation, but not quite every situation you can come up with. If you are using an enormous amount of Namahu tribe tattoos, then in that case, you'll find that Kaum's Leadership is worth, but you need an enormous amount. So that's all the things that are going on with Ancestral Commander. The strike section has also changed quite a bit as well, and the strike section is now messier, but still pretty good. So if you're wanting to play Ancestral Commander, you could go with a strike skill, or you could go with the slam setup. If you go with the slam setup, it's going to take longer to get online than it was. It's going to be worse than it was. If you go with the strike setup, it's going to be something probably better than it was, but it's also going to be just generally different. Ancestral Commander, still very playable, but not nearly as dominant as it was in the last time that Phrecia was available. Also, Behemoth got some changes. The most important thing to note here is that you can now use Heralds, and you can use spells that don't deal damage, but that cause you to get some sort of defensive buff on your character or an offensive buff. So you can use Molten Shell, you can use Steel Skin, or you can use Blood Rage. Blood Rage probably being one of the main ones. These are all available now. Heralds are available now. Basically, Behemoth is much better than it used to be, but previously existing Behemoth builds don't work anymore quite often because they had different workarounds that meant that they could work. So basically everything is different here. The other thing to note is that the 8 mana per 4 strength ends up being an enormous amount of armor indirectly as well. Mental conditioning is quite a bit better than it was. There might be some builds around that. Down in the shadow, the Surfcaster is getting both nerfed and buffed at the same time. This is going to end up being a net nerf at very, very low character level, and it's going to be something that ends up with the Surfcaster will still be an S tier leveling build, but it's less of an S tier leveling build than it used to be. And then once you get to endgame, it's kind of roughly a wash. You have less movement speed. You're going to have 7% less movement speed than you used to have, but there's a few other things where you're gaining cast speed. Definitely melee Surfcasters are worse than they used to be, but I don't think very many people were playing melee on them, except for the fact that Lightning Strike was so good in 3.25, and with Lightning Strike not so good anymore, I don't think that's going to be very popular. Servant of Arakaali is picking up a bunch of small buffs. These don't really change its identity. This is the S plus tier leveling setup, mostly because you can get Envy really early on, and Envy is crazy. Envy gives so much damage, it turns level 8 spell damage into level 14 spell damage. It doesn't hold up at endgame, but it's ridiculously good early on, and it will just power you from the time that you get it through to the end of the campaign, maybe even through to the end of white tier and into yellow tier maps. It will just hard carry you all that way. Blind Prophet is getting nerfed. Blind Prophet is going from being a very good ascendancy at all levels of gear to an ascendancy that really kind of falls off hard. It's still going to be crazy good from the time you get your second and third labyrinth, because especially once you get your third labyrinth, you got +2 projectiles, you've got returning projectiles. Only 50% chance to return, but that's still really good. However, at the same time, the Blind Prophet is getting less of its critical strike chance bonus than it used to have. So that first node, which you are forced to take, that is a fairly substantial nerf. In terms of the amount of damage that's lost here, this is a little bit less severe than losing an entire support gem. The reason I say that is that a base critical strike chance of 9% plus increased critical strike chance support is going to end up being better than 12% would be. So you're going to end up coming out ahead with that configuration. You've got the option to go there, but that is -1 support gem. So you can basically get it back at that cost. That is the Blind Prophet nerf. The other thing, though, that's noticeable with Blind Prophet is that a lot of weapons have been buffed, and that makes this first notable intrinsically worse than it would otherwise be. Blind Prophet, though, is still very, very playable ascendancy. I just think that this is going to be one of those ascendancies where once you can afford Nimbus, you will definitely want to reroll. You want to play something else once you can afford Nimbus. The Witch has the Harbinger. The Harbinger is just really thoroughly getting reworked. Things are getting moved around in the ascendancy. Additionally, a number of the points are getting boosted in their magnitude, but they're becoming 4-pointers, whereas previously they were travel nodes. So the fact they're swapping 2-pointer and 4-pointer nodes means that all existing Harbinger builds are dead and new ones need to be discovered. I also really find it funny the naming that they used here, where they say the passive the community believes is called Weakness Quelled, Spirit Awoken, because they're all written in code. Herald is next. Herald is the big winner of these patch notes. Herald receives a bunch of little buffs that don't add up to a huge amount, but do add up to something. However, the most important thing here is that Scourge is not getting nerfed. Scourge is the one that gives 25 maximum virulence if you are playing a Herald of Agony build. That thing is crazy. 25 virulence is worth your entire ascendancy on its own. And then on top of that, you also get 15% spell poison. You also get a whole bunch of mana reservation efficiency. You also get a whole bunch of other things like 80% chaos resistance. Basically, Herald is looking fantastic now. It already was looking fantastic. It's just slightly better. And Bog Shaman is losing a bunch of its really severe drawbacks. So Felfen no longer has your chaos resistance is 0. Guess what? This means you can use it now. Vile Imprecations is being changed. This was one that I made a lot of mistakes on the live stream about because I was reading down the list in the wrong order. So I had already looked at Vile Imprecations because I was looking at something that was locked behind it. And I was thinking, oh, why are people saying that this has changed? Well, actually, because it was in this list of notes, but it was down further in the list. Vile Imprecations is no longer blasphemy only. Instead, it's just +1 curse, which is really, really good. Toad Pact is being doubled down on. The drawback is worse, but the benefits are better, and that is going to be worthwhile taking overall. Even though the 40 elemental resistances drawback is genuinely meaningful, that is going to put pressure on your gear. It's going to mean worse suffixes in general on your gear. You can definitely make up for that, and the payoff here is really substantial. 75% in KOE, and also 75% skill effect duration is kind of a hard stat to get in large numbers. So if you're playing any build that can scale off proj speed, AoE, or ink skill effect duration, Toad Pact is now better than it was. Basically everything about the Bog Shaman has been buffed there. In the Duelist, the Gambler gets a bunch of small buffs. I have played around a lot with this. I can't make it work. There's going to be things that function on the Gambler. It's definitely a functioning ascendancy. It's good enough, but it just feels like it's Paladin but worse on a lot of things. Aristocrat but worse at high gear level. And in general, I don't see a niche where it really shines, even though it's okay at everything. Paladin, good at everything, got slight little upgrades here, but these upgrades actually don't matter because these are to notables you would not have been taking in general. The Paladin has quite a solid core of things you're going to want to take, and as a result, buffs to things that aren't in that core don't really matter very much. And then the Aristocrat got a whole bunch of buffs. The Aristocrat was the stacking setup. So this is the stat stacker, and it's not really good until your character is already pretty rich. So this is a second character build, but there is a lot of power here in the Aristocrat. This was already a good ascendancy, but it's just gotten a lot better, especially because Crystallized Omniscience is now more accessible than it used to be, and the Aristocrat has tremendous synergy with that. Architect of Chaos got very, very tiny changes that don't really matter very much. This is an underrated ascendancy. It's not truly amazing, but there would be different metas in which this would really be amazing. If this was the Legion League meta, or if it was the Sentinel League meta, then the Architect of Chaos would be an S tier build already, without any further changes, and that would just be due to how well it can use Vaal Ice Nova. Vaal Ice Nova, it would be absolutely crazy with, but not that many people are playing content where that is something that can really shine. Polytheist. We had a lot of discussion on the stream about this. Polytheist is one of those ascendancies that gains a lot of little bonuses in these patch notes, but they don't add up to a lot. The thing that makes the Polytheist better than it used to be, though, is two other changes. Firstly, light radius. They've preemptively realized that players were going to be running Polytheist primarily to stack a lot of light radius, and then use it in conjunction with Eclipse Solaris, a wand that got buffed in patch 3.27, and it is, fair warning, Eclipse Solaris is a tier 1 rarity unique now, so that thing is quite rare. So what that item does now is every 1 point that your light radius exceeds the base value, you end up gaining 2 to 5 flat fire to attacks with that weapon. So each of these small passives is giving you a whole chunk of flat fire damage. If they hadn't made this change, where it used to be 10% light radius, 5% global defenses, then Polytheist would have been the only way to play that setup. Instead, they've decided, right, we're going to tone down the light radius by buffing the ascendancy in general. So the small notables are better than they used to be on the Polytheist, except for that one build, that light radius stacking build. And on that light radius stacking build, they're quite a bit worse than they used to be. Otherwise, there's a bunch of little changes in here. The problem with Polytheist was always you could find 4 cohesive points, you might even find 6, but then you had nothing to spend the rest of them on. That's actually been improved not by any changes that are found in these patch notes, but instead by changes that have been made to the core game with the introduction of Bloodline ascendancies. If you are thinking, by looking at the Polytheist, that, gee, Devout of Lunaris would be absolutely fantastic on my build, then in that situation, have a quick think. You can take Relikesh, you can take Devout of Lunaris, and then you can spend 4 points over in a Bloodline ascendancy. That's a new option that you didn't have in the past, and it might end up being the way to play this ascendancy now. Puppeteer is unfortunately not looking too good because it maintains that line of text that causes it to go from maybe this is playable to this is a meme. And that is, your zombies count as corpses. That means that enemies can cast Detonate Dead on your zombies, and if you know anything about Detonate Dead when it's cast by enemies in Path of Exile, it's pretty dangerous. So that's a Puppeteer. Unfortunately, all of the branch that is behind those points are pretty much not takeable, and that means that a lot of the themes of this ascendancy just don't work. Scavenger is getting nerfs. None of these are crushing. All of them are meaningful. Void Battery and Cloak of Flame are getting worse. There are also some buffs here as well. Doomfletch, Midnight Bargain, Oro's Sacrifice, and Starforge are all getting buffed, but those are choices people weren't making. Of these, Doomfletch is probably the most interesting to take, and Cloak of Flame, honestly, even at 30%, it's so good, you kind of have to take it. That's the way it is. Anyway, those are the changes that are taking place from yesterday. So the Monster Steel Charges on Hit mod has now been removed from the pool of area modifiers, random area modifiers. And with the Harbinger Ascendancy, you can have one of each type of Harbinger. You are not hard capped to one Harbinger across your entire character, the way that the community generally thought was the way it worked. Instead, it is one per Harbinger type, so you can feel free to spec into more of those if you want to. Whether that's worth it or not, I'll leave up to you. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.